manustolite, estatimoti et moledetur. Hoc questro latruscinium, arcam materite.
Latin, the language of power, of law, and of knowledge. For centuries, it was the language of jurists, philosophers, and theologians, the language in which imperial decrees were written, scientific treatises composed, and the solemn words of the Church proclaimed. It was the language of emperors, of priests, and of the educated men of their time. But Latin traveled farther than many people imagine. It crossed oceans, survived in dusty libraries, and unexpectedly even reached the wild territories of the American West. There, on a frontier marked by violence, duels, and bank robberies, emerged men whose stories contradict the myth of the ignorant outlaw. Because some of the most dangerous outlaws of the Old West did not only wield revolvers, they also mastered classical languages. This is the story of the educated outlaws of the Old West.
The content of this video is presented for educational and historical purposes. It does not seek to glorify, justify, or promote violence or crime, but rather to offer a critical and contextualized look at historical events and figures.
Cinema taught us that the outlaws of the Old West were ignorant men, illiterate, violent, and uneducated. Impulsive men guided only by gunpowder, whiskey, and the law of the revolver. For decades, films and novels reinforced this image. Wild bandits living outside civilization, incapable of reading a letter or signing their own names. But historical reality is far more complex. Behind some of the most feared criminals of the American frontier were men who could read, write, and who sometimes possessed a surprisingly solid education for their time. Some debated politics in saloons. Others wrote elegant letters or composed poetry. There were outlaws who had once been teachers, soldiers, or even students before becoming fugitives. On a frontier marked by violence, war, and the collapse of social order after the American Civil War, many of these men found themselves trapped between two worlds, the world of civilization and the world of the revolver. This documentary explores who these men really were, how they turned to crime, and what their stories reveal about the true nature of the Old West. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States was officially reunited. But beneath the surface, the nation remained deeply fractured. 4 years of war had left scars that would not disappear easily. Cities destroyed, fields devastated, families separated forever. The South had been left in ruins. Much of its infrastructure lay shattered, its plantations devastated, and its economic system completely collapsed. Thousands of young men returned home after years on the battlefield. Many of them knew nothing but war. They had learned to ride horses, to shoot, to survive in hostile territory. But now, in times of peace, those skills had little place in a society trying to rebuild itself. Southern economies were destroyed. Banks had failed. Farms had been abandoned. Trade had nearly collapsed. Meanwhile, industrial capital from the north began expanding rapidly into the west. Railroads, banks, and powerful corporations started to control vast portions of the American frontier. For many former Confederate soldiers, this new order did not represent reconciliation, but a permanent defeat. Many felt displaced in their own country. Without work, without a clear future, and accustomed to violence, some of these men found in the frontier a new way of life, a life outside the law. Bands of former soldiers began appearing across different territories of the West. They robbed banks, They held up trains. They attacked stagecoaches carrying money or mail. For them, the war had not ended. It had simply changed form. Now, the enemy was no longer an opposing army, but the new order dominating the American frontier. And in that world of gunpowder, resentment, and chaos, some of the most famous and complex figures of the Old West would emerge. Outlaws who did not only know how to shoot, but also how to think. Jesse James was not the ignorant farmer that many movies have portrayed. He was the son of a Baptist preacher, Robert S. James, a deeply religious man who taught theology and had studied in seminary. Jesse grew up in a household where the Bible was read, but ideas were also debated. In the family home, people spoke about religion, politics, and the fate of the South in an increasingly divided nation. It was an environment where words carried weight, where arguments mattered. When the war broke out, Missouri became one of the most violent territories of the conflict. A place where the line between war and guerrilla warfare almost disappeared. During the American Civil War, the young Jesse joined Confederate guerrilla groups led by men like William Quantrill and William T. Anderson. There, he learned more than how to shoot. He learned irregular warfare, ambush tactics, sabotage, and the use of psychological terror to dominate the enemy. When the war ended, Jesse returned to a devastated Missouri. But for him, the fight had not ended. It had simply changed stages. Now the enemy, in his mind, was the new economic order dominating the defeated South. The banks, the railroads, and the institutions that represented Northern power. After some of his most famous robberies, Jesse James did something few criminals of his time would have done. He wrote letters to newspapers. They were not simple threats, they were manifestos. In them, he defended his actions, criticized the federal government, and denounced what he saw as abuses against former Confederate states. He used surprisingly elaborate language. He argued, he justified, he presented himself not as a bandit, but as a political fighter, a man who was continuing, in his own way, the struggle that had begun during the war. During the robbery of the Gallatin Bank in Missouri in 1869, several witnesses recalled a curious detail. As the heist unfolded, Jesse didn't just bark orders or shout threats. He spoke with the teller. He argued about local politics, about the influence of banks controlled by Northern capital, about how, in his view, those institutions had ruined many citizens of Missouri. He didn't yell, he didn't insult, he debated. It was the language of someone used to discussing ideas. That detail reveals something important about his character. Jesse James didn't rob on impulse. He robbed with a conviction he himself saw as ideological. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a symbol of resistance from the defeated South. But one thing seems clear. He was not the ignorant bandit many stories have tried to portray. Cole Younger came from a relatively well-off family in Missouri. He did not grow up in poverty or abandonment. His family owned land, held a certain social position, and like many young men in the South before the war, he received a formal education. He learned to read, to write, and to move within a society where honor, politics, and family loyalty were fundamental values. But like many men of his generation, his destiny changed dramatically with the outbreak of the American Civil War. Missouri became one of the most brutal theaters of the conflict, a divided territory where loyalty was fractured and where conventional warfare quickly gave way to guerrilla fighting. Cole Younger joined irregular Confederate fighters and learned combat tactics that were not taught in military academies. Ambushes, rapid mobility on horseback, surprise attacks, coordination between small armed groups. Skills designed for survival in a war with no clear rules. When the war ended, many of these men returned to a devastated society. But the skills they had acquired did not disappear. And for some of them, those same tactics would soon be applied to a different kind of operation: robberies. One of the most famous episodes occurred during the failed bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota in 1876, carried out by the James Younger Gang.
Witnesses and later accounts suggest that even in the middle of the chaos of the robbery, members of the gang were discussing matters that sounded more like a military operation than a simple bank heist.
They talked about positions, about time control, about escape routes, about coordination between the men stationed outside the bank and those inside. They did not behave like improvised thieves. They behaved like war veterans who still thought in terms of strategy. Like former soldiers who no longer had an army, but still operated as if they did. The Northfield robbery ended in disaster. The townspeople armed themselves and fought back against the attackers. Several members of the gang were killed or captured. Cole Younger was among those captured. He was convicted and sent to prison, where he would spend many years of his life. But even behind bars, his story did not end. During his imprisonment, Younger did something uncommon among criminals of the Old West. He wrote. He reflected on his life, on the war that had shaped his generation, and on the decisions that had led him to become an outlaw. His memoirs, later published under the title The Story of Cole Younger, reveal a man capable of analyzing his past with surprising introspection. He does not only recount robberies and pursuits. He writes about politics, about honor, about the defeat of the South, and about the weight the war left on many men who never fully managed to return to civilian life. Some men manage to leave war behind. Others carry it with them for the rest of their lives. And some end up writing about it from a prison cell. Doc Holliday. His real name was John Henry Holliday, and his story completely breaks the stereotype of the uneducated gunslinger of the Old West. Before becoming a legendary figure in saloons, gambling tables, and gunfights, Holliday had followed a very different path. He did not first learn to shoot. He learned to treat teeth. He came from a respected Southern family and received a formal education that was uncommon on the American frontier. He was a trained dentist. He studied at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, one of the most prestigious institutions of its time in that field. There, he received scientific, medical, and humanistic training. As part of his classical education, he studied languages and traditional texts. Among them, Latin, the language of medicine, law, and higher education in the 19th century.
But his promising career changed abruptly when he was diagnosed with a disease that, at the time, was almost a death sentence: tuberculosis. Doctors recommended that he leave the humid climate of the eastern United States.
The dry air of the West offered, at least in theory, a chance to prolong his life. And so began his journey toward the frontier. A journey that would take him from a dentist's office to the dusty towns of the American West. In the saloons of the frontier, Holliday became something very different from a doctor. He became a professional gambler, a dangerous profession where intellectual skill was just as important as speed with a revolver. Witnesses of the time described Holliday as a thin, pale, and extremely well-educated man, someone who could discuss literature, politics, or history minutes before a gunfight broke out. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His style was different. He used irony, refined sarcasm, a way of speaking that clearly reflected his education. At the gambling tables, his intelligence became even more evident. As a professional gambler, he mastered abilities that went far beyond luck. Rapid mental calculation, psychological reading of his opponents, emotional control under extreme pressure. He knew when to take risks, when to walk away, when to provoke. He understood probabilities, and he also understood that in the violent world of the West, dying young was not a remote possibility, but a very real probability. Despite his fragile health, Holiday earned a fearsome reputation, not only for his skill with cards, but also for his friendship with the famous lawman Wyatt Earp, with whom he would take part in one of the most famous confrontations of the Old West, the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. There, the educated Southern dentist became a legend. Holiday's story reveals something the myth of the West often hides. The frontier was not populated only by ignorant or violent men. There were also educated men, men trained in universities, men who carried with them books, ideas, and a culture that seemed incompatible with the brutal world in which they eventually lived.
Doc Holliday was one of them, an educated man who ended up using his intelligence to survive the chaos of the Old West.
Butch Cassidy did not seek gunfights. Unlike many gunslingers of the West, he was not interested in proving his speed with a revolver or building a reputation based on duels. He preferred something far more effective: planning. His real name was Robert Leroy Parker, and those who knew him described him as a calm, observant, and surprisingly methodical man. He did not have a formal university education, but he was a self-taught reader. He learned by observing, listening, analyzing every detail of the world around him. He had an unusual ability to study systems, how trains operated, how banks worked, how trade routes were organized across the West. More than a simple thief, Cassidy acted like a logistics organizer, a strategist. When he formed the gang known as the Wild Bunch, his goal was not chaos, it was to design almost perfect robberies. Before a heist, the gang carried out preparations that looked more like a military operation than the work of improvised criminals. They cut telegraph lines to prevent authorities from sending warnings. They carefully studied train schedules. They observed the movements of guards, employees, and passengers. They calculated how long it would take for sheriffs or railroad agents to respond. They analyzed escape routes into mountains or deserts where pursuit would be difficult. Nothing was left entirely to chance. That level of preparation reveals something important. This was not simple brutality. It was criminal engineering. A carefully designed system meant to maximize success and minimize risk, and above all, to avoid unnecessary violence. Unlike many other outlaws, Cassidy had a reputation for preferring clean robberies. Go in fast, control the situation, leave before the shooting begins. In a sense, he had understood a fundamental rule of organized crime, a rule that few gunslingers of the Old West seemed to understand. Intelligence reduces violence. The better a job is planned, the less blood is spilled. And that is why, in many robberies led by Butch Cassidy, witnesses remembered something surprising: calm, clear orders, precise movements.
And a leader who always seemed to be thinking several steps ahead. He was not the fastest gun in the West, but he may have been one of the smartest. This is not a myth. It is documented. In the Old West, there were gunslingers, thieves, and killers.
Men fast with a revolver, violent gangs, outlaws hunted by the law. But there was one man who did something completely unthinkable for his time. He wrote poetry.
His name was Black Bart. His real name was Charles Earl Bowles, also known as Charles Bowles. For years, this mysterious bandit operated in the mountains and roads of California between 1875 and 1883.
He had been a soldier in the American Civil War. He was an educated man, a regular reader, methodical to the point of obsession. Unlike most outlaws of the West, Black Bart followed very particular rules. He did not shoot, he did not wound, he did not shout. He robbed stagecoaches, usually alone, armed with little more than an unloaded shotgun, or even sticks hidden under a blanket to imitate rifles. He dressed with elegance, dark coat, carefully placed hat.
And he acted with a calmness that deeply unsettled his victims. He would appear in the middle of the road, stop the stagecoach, and give a quiet order. Please throw down the strongbox.
He did not insult. He did not threaten unnecessarily. He simply waited. But what truly made him a unique figure in the history of the West was something far stranger. Black Bart left handwritten poems at the scenes of his robberies, small verses, carefully composed, sometimes signed with the name Black Bart, the P.O.8. One of the most famous was found after a failed robbery. In it, he wrote, "Here I lay me down to sleep, to wait the coming morrow. Perhaps success, perhaps defeat, and everlasting sorrow." It did not sound like a joke. It sounded like a confession. The words revealed something rarely associated with an Old West outlaw: introspection, melancholy, an awareness of his own fate. In another poem, he left an even more direct message, one that seemed addressed to the men who were hunting him. "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches." It was not simply an insult. It was the lament of a man who felt he had been pushed to the margins of society. Black Bart did not see himself as an ordinary criminal. He saw himself as a man driven by circumstance. During his years of activity, he committed more than 20 robberies. And yet, something still fascinates historians. He never fired a shot at anyone. He never killed anyone. When he was finally captured, he did so with surprising calm. He confessed, accepted his fate, and was sentenced by the courts. But even in prison, the man who had terrorized stagecoaches with poems continued to write. The story of Black Bart challenges the simple myth of the Wild West. He was not the typical gunslinger. He was not a killer. He was something far stranger. And perhaps more unsettling, an outlaw who thought, who read, and who wrote poetry in the middle of crime. Johnny Ringo, the outlaw who quoted the classics. In the Old West, gunslingers were everywhere. Men fast with a revolver, gamblers, bandits, killers. But Johnny Ringo was different. He was not the fastest with a gun, nor the most lethal, but he was one of the most educated and one of the most enigmatic men ever to walk the dusty streets of the West. Those who knew him agreed on something unsettling. Ringo spoke very little, and when he did, he quoted poets and classical authors. That was not the usual way a gunslinger spoke. While others argued about horses, whiskey, or money, Ringo might mention William Shakespeare or recite verses from Virgil. That contrast made him an almost legendary figure, an outlaw who seemed to come from another world. Johnny Ringo was born in Greens Fork, Indiana, into a family that was relatively educated by the standards of the 19th century American frontier. He received formal schooling, he learned to read and write fluently, and according to later accounts, he was exposed early to classical texts and English literature, something unusual for someone who would later become a gunslinger. But his youth was marked by tragedy. During a journey westward, his father died violently when his shotgun accidentally discharged while they were traveling in a wagon. The impact was devastating for the family. Ringo's childhood was forever marked by that moment, a turning point that many historians believe shaped the course of his life. Then came the decisive context, the American Civil War. The conflict did not only destroy cities and economies,
It also left thousands of young men displaced, armed, accustomed to violence, and without a clear place in civilian society.
many had learned how to survive in chaos, but they did not know how to return to normal life. Johnny Ringo was one of those men. Like many future outlaws of the West, his generation became trapped between the education they had received and a world that had suddenly become brutally unstable. Unlike many gunslingers of his time, Ringo read. He read William Shakespeare, he quoted Virgil, and he could recite verses from memory. Witnesses claimed that, drunk or sober, he could suddenly drop Latin phrases or literary references in the middle of violent arguments inside saloons. It deeply unsettled the people around him. It was not an act. It was not an attempt to appear sophisticated. It was education mixed with bitterness. Ringo seemed to carry a mind too reflective for the brutal world in which he lived. Many contemporaries described him as a melancholic, introspective, almost philosophical man. He did not enjoy violence the way other gunslingers did. Instead, he seemed pulled toward it. Those who knew him remembered him as quiet, dark, obsessed with death, a man who understood the world but seemed unable to find his place within it. When he arrived in Tombstone, Arizona, Ringo eventually aligned himself with the group known as the Cowboys. This group had a fierce rivalry with the lawmen led by Wyatt Earp. Although Ringo was never present at the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, he was part of the atmosphere of tension, hatred, and revenge that surrounded Tombstone after the shootout. In that environment of resentment, threats, and settling of scores, Ringo became a dangerous figure. Not only because of his skill with weapons, but because of his mind. Wyatt Earp considered him an especially dangerous man, not necessarily because of his aim, but because of his intelligence. Ringo did not act impulsively. He thought, he analyzed, and that made him unpredictable. On July 13, 1882, Johnny Ringo was found dead in Turkey Creek Canyon, Arizona. His body lay beneath a tree. He had a gunshot wound to the head. His revolver was still in his hand. There were no witnesses. No definitive explanation. The official version declared it a suicide, but ever since then, other theories have emerged. Was he murdered? Was it a revenge killing? Or did an enemy take advantage of his drunken state to eliminate him? The mystery was never solved. The Civil War created a generation of men educated for war, and then abandoned them. Untreated trauma, no clear purpose, no place in the new economy. The West did not turn them into criminals. It gave them a stage. The Old West was not a place of pure ignorance. It was a place where educated men applied their knowledge outside the law. They were not monsters. They were the echo of a war the United States never fully buried. And perhaps the real question is not why they became outlaws, but what might have become of them if the war had truly ended. If you're interested in the stories almost nobody tells, forgotten historical curiosities, and the characters who don't quite fit in the official history books, subscribe to Canned Stories. Here, we talk about the past like it has never been told to you before.